When did your parents set your life ablaze? The question came from my therapist, Delphine, during our third session. She had a way of asking things that made you feel like you'd been struck by lightning in slow motion. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched the afternoon light filter through her office blinds, creating patterns on the carpet that reminded me of the wallpaper in my childhood bedroom, the one my mother chose, the one my father tore down the night everything changed. I was 14 when my parents decided that honesty was no longer a family value. They'd built our life on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, the kind that looked like stability from the outside, but rotted everything from within. We lived in a brick colonial with white shutters, the kind of house that made neighbors assume we were good people. My father ran a consulting firm. At least that's what we told people. What he actually did was leverage other people's desperation into profit. He bought failing businesses, stripped them of value, and left the carcasses behind. My mother kept the books. She knew every dollar, every manipulation, every family destroyed in the wake of their ambition. The fire, the literal one, happened on a Tuesday in October. I remember because I had a geometry test the next day, and I'd been studying when I smelled smoke, not the comforting kind from a fireplace, the acrid chemical smell of things burning that shouldn't burn. My father had set fire to his office, destroying years of documents that would have sent both of them to prison. What he didn't account for was the wind shifting, carrying embers to the neighbor's property. The Kowalski family lost their garage, their 2 cars, and nearly their youngest daughter, Petra, who had been playing in the backyard. I watched from my window as my parents stood in our driveway, faces illuminated by the flames, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. They weren't scared. They were calculating. Within 3 days, we had relocated across the country. New names on the mailbox, new story for the neighbors. I was told my past no longer existed, that I should forget everyone I'd ever known. My grandmother, my cousins, my best friend Linnea, all erased like pencil marks on paper. For years, I complied. I became who they needed me to be. Quiet, forgettable, complicit. I graduated high school with honors and a hollow feeling in my chest that I couldn't name. I went to college on their dime, studied business because they expected it, and never once questioned the life they'd constructed around me like a cage made of silk. The unraveling began when I was 26. A woman approached me at a coffee shop. She had Petra Kowalski's same sharp cheekbones and dark eyes. She introduced herself as Marin, Petra's older sister. She'd been looking for us for 12 years. The conversation lasted 4 hours. She told me things about that night I'd never known, that Petra had suffered burns covering 30% of her body, that their family had lost everything in medical bills, that the insurance company had denied their claims because the fire was ruled arson with an unknown source. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. For the first time, I saw my parents clearly. Not as protectors, but as architects of destruction who had used my love as a tool for their escape. 3 months later, I made a choice. I contacted a journalist named Yosef, who had been investigating financial crimes in our old city. I gave him everything: account numbers I'd memorized, conversations I'd overheard, patterns I'd noticed in their behavior over decades of careful observation. The article published on a Sunday morning. By Monday, federal agents were at my parents' door. I watched from across the street, hidden in a rental car, as they were let out in handcuffs. My mother looked directly at me through the window. I know she saw me. What I didn't expect was the envelope that arrived 3 weeks later. Inside was a single photograph. Me, at age 7, holding hands with a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, "She deserves to know the truth." I stared at that photograph for 3 days straight. The woman beside me had dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, a wide smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and she was wearing a blue sundress with small white flowers. I was grinning up at her with the kind of unguarded joy that children possess before the world teaches them to be careful. We were standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, a small craftsman with a red door and overgrown rose bushes climbing the porch rails. I turned the photograph over again, tracing my grandmother's handwriting with my fingertip. The loops of her letters were familiar, even after 12 years. She used to write me notes and hide them in my lunchbox. Little things like, "You are braver than you know," or, "Remember, kindness is never wasted." I'd saved every single one until the night we left, when my mother told me to pack only what I could carry in one bag. The postmark on the envelope was smudged, but I could make out enough. It had been mailed from a town called Hartwell, about 40 miles from where we'd lived before the fire. My grandmother had never lived there, as far as I knew. She'd had a small apartment in the city, close enough to visit on weekends, far enough that my parents could control the narrative of our lives. I called Marin that night. We'd stayed in touch since that first conversation at the coffee shop. She'd become something like a friend, though our relationship was built on shared wreckage rather than shared joy. "I got something in the mail," I told her, "from my grandmother." "Your grandmother? I thought you said you hadn't spoken to any of your family since—" "I haven't, but she found me somehow. Or someone did." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Marin said, "What did she send?" I described the photograph, the woman, the message on the back. Marin listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd come to appreciate about her. "Do you want to find out who she is?" she asked when I finished. I didn't answer right away. The truth was I wasn't sure. For 12 years, I'd lived inside a story my parents had written for me. Now that story had collapsed, and I was standing in the rubble, trying to figure out which pieces were real and which had been fabricated. Adding another mystery felt like too much, but the photograph kept pulling at me. The woman's smile, the way my 7-year-old self leaned into her, trusting and open. Whoever she was, she had mattered to me once. "Yes," I finally said. "I think I do." Finding my grandmother turned out to be easier than I expected. The return address on the envelope led me to a retirement community called Willowbrook Gardens, a cluster of small cottages arranged around a central courtyard. I drove there on a Saturday morning, my hands sweating on the steering wheel despite the cool autumn air. The woman who answered the door looked older than I remembered, but her eyes were the same, sharp and knowing, with that particular warmth that had always made me feel seen. "Vera," she said, using the name she'd given me at birth, not the one my parents had chosen when we ran. "I wondered how long it would take you to come." I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 12 years. It hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. My grandmother, I'd always called her Nana, stepped back to let me in. Her cottage was small but bright, filled with plants and books and photographs in mismatched frames. I scanned the images automatically, looking for faces I recognized. I found myself at various ages, as a toddler, a gap-toothed elementary schooler, a sullen teenager, but I also found the woman from the photograph, appearing again and again. In some pictures, she was young, barely out of her teens. In others, she was older, her dark hair streaked with gray. "Sit down," Nana said, gesturing to a faded floral couch. "I'll make tea. We have a lot to talk about." While she busied herself in the small kitchen, I kept studying the photographs. The woman appeared in at least a dozen of them, sometimes alone, sometimes with me, sometimes with a baby I didn't recognize. In one image, she was standing next to my mother, both of them much younger than I'd ever seen them. They were dressed similarly, both in jeans and oversized sweaters, and they were laughing at something outside the frame. "That was taken in 1987, Nana said, returning with 2 cups of tea. She handed one to me and settled into an armchair across from the couch. "Your mother was 22. Celeste was 20. Celeste? The name felt foreign in my mouth. Nana took a long sip of her tea before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but I could see the effort it took to keep it that way. "Celeste was your mother's younger sister, your aunt. She died when you were 8 years old." I set down my tea because my hands had started shaking. "I don't have an aunt. Mom never mentioned." "No," Nana said. "She wouldn't have. After what happened, she refused to speak Celeste's name. She erased her from our family's history as thoroughly as she later erased everything else." The photograph in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. I pulled it out and held it up. "This woman? This is Celeste?" Nana nodded. "That was taken the summer before she died. You two were inseparable that year. She adored you, and you adored her right back." I looked at the photograph again, trying to reconcile this new information with the blank space where memories should have been. I had no recollection of this woman, no flicker of recognition, no buried sense of familiarity, just an absence where something important used to be. "What happened to her?" I asked. Nana set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Your parents happened to her." The story Nana told me that afternoon rewrote everything I thought I knew about my family. Celeste had been the dreamer of the 2 sisters. Artistic, impractical, full of ideas that never quite translated into stable employment. She'd studied painting in college, then drifted through a series of odd jobs: waitressing, house painting, teaching art classes at a community center. My mother had always been the responsible one, the planner, the one who kept her feet firmly on the ground. When my mother met my father, Celeste had been wary of him from the start. She'd told Nana that something about him felt wrong, that his charm was too practiced, his stories too smooth. My mother had dismissed her concerns as jealousy. After I was born, Celeste became my unofficial babysitter. She'd take me to parks and museums, teach me to mix colors on a palette, make up elaborate stories about the adventures we'd have someday. I was too young to remember any of this consciously, but as Nana described it, I felt something stir in me, a ghost of recognition, like hearing a song you haven't heard since childhood. Things changed when Celeste stumbled onto what my parents were actually doing with their business. She'd been at their house one evening, looking for a book she'd left behind, when she found a folder of documents my father had forgotten to lock away. Inside were records of the families he'd destroyed, the businesses gutted, the savings stolen, the lives dismantled for profit. Celeste had confronted my mother first. She'd begged her to leave my father, to go to the police, to do something before more people got hurt. My mother's response was to cut Celeste out of our lives entirely. Suddenly, I wasn't allowed to see my aunt anymore. Nana's visits became supervised and tense. The warmth I'd known as a young child was replaced by something cold and controlled. Celeste didn't give up, though, Nana said. She started gathering evidence on her own. She was going to go to the authorities, make sure your parents couldn't hurt anyone else. What stopped her? Nana's eyes filled with tears for the first time since I'd arrived. A car accident. At least that's what the police ruled it. She lost control on a mountain road, went through a guardrail, and fell 200 feet into a ravine. I felt sick. You don't think it was an accident? I know it wasn't. Nana's voice had turned hard, all the softness burned away by years of suppressed rage. The brake lines had been tampered with. I hired a private investigator after the official case was closed, and he found evidence the police had missed, or been paid to ignore. But by then, your parents had already destroyed everything Celeste had gathered. There was nothing left to connect them to her death. I sat there, unable to move, unable to speak. My parents had done terrible things. I'd known that since Marin found me, but this was different. This was murder. They had killed my mother's own sister to protect their secrets, and then they had erased her from existence so completely that I'd never even known she existed. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I finally managed. "When I was growing up, when I still lived with them. Why didn't you say something?" "I tried," Nana's voice cracked. I tried so many times. But your parents controlled everything. They monitored your phone calls, read your mail, limited my visits to a few hours every few months. And I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, they'd do to you what they did to Celeste. So I waited. I watched. I kept the evidence safe, hoping that someday I'd have a chance to tell you the truth. She reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a thick manila envelope. This is everything Celeste gathered, plus what my investigator found afterward. Bank records, photographs, witness statements. I've been holding on to it for 18 years, waiting for the right moment. I took the envelope with trembling hands. Why now? Why send me that photograph? Because you did something I never had the courage to do, Nana said. You turned them in. You broke the cycle. When I saw the news about their arrest, I knew it was finally time. I spent the next week going through Celeste's files. There were hundreds of pages, organized with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of obsession and grief. My aunt had documented everything. The shell companies my father used to hide money, the fake identities my mother created, the dozens of families they'd left in financial ruin. But the most devastating part wasn't the financial crimes. It was the personal testimony. Celeste had interviewed people my parents had hurt. Widows who'd lost their life savings, small business owners who'd been driven to bankruptcy, employees who'd been laid off without warning or severance. She'd recorded their stories, collected their photographs, noted down the dates and details of how their lives had been destroyed. I recognized some of the names. A few had been mentioned in Yosef's article. Others were new to me, casualties I'd never known about. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. My parents had built their comfortable life on the suffering of more people than I could count. I called Yosef and told him about the new evidence. He was cautious at first. The case against my parents was already strong, and adding a potential murder to the charges was a significant escalation. But when I sent him copies of the files, he went quiet for a long time. This is going to change everything, he said finally. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Celeste, about the woman in the photograph who had loved me and been erased. I thought about the Kowalski family, about Petra's burns and the years of medical bills. I thought about all the people in those files, the lives my parents had torn apart without a second thought. Yes, I said. I'm ready. The investigation into Celeste's death took 7 months. I testified 3 times, once to the grand jury, twice at preliminary hearings. Each time I had to sit in the same room as my parents and describe the evidence that proved they were killers. My father watched me with an expression I couldn't read. My mother wouldn't look at me at all. The trial itself lasted 4 weeks. Yosef's article had already convicted them in the court of public opinion, but the legal process was slower, more methodical. Witness after witness took the stand. The private investigator Nana had hired, a forensic mechanic who testified about the brake lines, former employees who described the fear that permeated my parents' company. I took the stand on the 15th day. The prosecutor, a woman named Ingrid with silver hair and a voice like gravel, asked me to describe my childhood. I told her about the lies, the control, the way my parents had systematically isolated me from everyone who might have told me the truth. I told her about the fire, about Petra Kowalski, about the night we fled our old life and started new ones built on fresh deceptions. When I finished, Ingrid asked me one final question. Did you love your parents? I thought about it for a long time before answering. The courtroom was silent, waiting. I loved who I thought they were, I finally said. I loved the parents I believed I had, but those people never existed. They were just another lie. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty. My father was sentenced to life without parole. My mother got 40 years. They were led out of the courtroom separately, neither of them looking at me as they passed. I stayed seated until the room emptied. Then I walked outside into the bright spring sunlight and called Nana. It's over, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, No, sweetheart. It's just beginning. She was right, of course. The trial was only the end of one chapter. What came next was the harder work of rebuilding. I moved to Hartwell to be closer to Nana. I found a small apartment in a converted Victorian, with creaky floors and windows that let in too much cold air. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first home I'd ever chosen for myself, without anyone else's expectations dictating my choices. I started seeing Delphine twice a week instead of once. We worked through the layers of guilt and grief that the trial had exposed. Guilt for not knowing sooner, for not stopping them earlier, for being complicit in their crimes even when I didn't understand what I was complicit in. Grief for the aunt I'd never gotten to know, for the childhood I might have had, for the person I might have become if I'd been raised by people capable of love. You're not responsible for their choices, Delphine told me during one session. Children don't get to choose their parents. The only choice you had was the one you made when you were 26, and you made the right one. I wanted to believe her. Most days, I almost could. Marin and I stayed close. She flew out to visit me twice that first year, and I went back to our old city once to see Petra. The scars from her burns were visible on her arms and neck, raised and white against her skin. But she smiled when she saw me, and she hugged me without hesitation. I don't blame you, she said. I never did. You were just a kid. I should have known, I said. I should have done something. You did do something. Eventually. That's what matters. I cried in her arms for a long time after that. It was the first time I'd let myself cry about any of it. Really cry, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and leaves you empty afterward. Petra held me through all of it. This woman I'd never really known, whose life my parents had nearly destroyed. Her forgiveness felt like a gift I hadn't earned. The summer after the trial, I started painting again. It had been years. I'd taken a few art classes in college before my parents steered me toward business courses, but I'd never pursued it seriously. Now, with Celeste's story fresh in my mind, I found myself drawn to it in ways I couldn't explain. I set up a small studio in the corner of my apartment, just an easel and some secondhand supplies from a local art store. The first few attempts were terrible, clumsy, amateurish, embarrassing, but I kept going, driven by something I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, Nana came to visit and found me covered in paint, struggling with a canvas that wasn't cooperating. "Celeste used to paint like that," she said, watching from the doorway. All intensity and frustration. She'd fight with her paintings like they were living things. Did she ever win? Sometimes. The good ones always came after the fights. She crossed the room and stood beside me, examining the canvas. It was supposed to be the house from the photograph, the craftsman with the red door, but it had come out wrong. The proportions were off, the colors muddy, the whole thing lifeless and flat. "You're trying too hard to get it right," Nana said. "Celeste used to say that the best paintings aren't about accuracy. They're about truth. What's the difference? Accuracy is getting the details right. Truth is capturing how something feels." She touched the edge of the canvas gently. "This house doesn't need to look exactly like the real thing. It needs to feel like what that house meant to you." I looked at the painting again, trying to see it through that lens. The house in the photograph had been Celeste's. I'd learned that from Nana's stories. She'd rented it for a few years, back when she was teaching art classes and barely making rent. It was where she'd taken me that summer, where we'd painted together and made up stories and been happy in a way I couldn't remember but somehow still felt. I picked up my brush and started again. The following year, I received a letter from my mother. It was the first contact either of my parents had attempted since the trial. The prison's return address was stamped in the corner, and my name, my real name, Vera, was written on the envelope in her familiar handwriting. I didn't open it for 3 days. It sat on my kitchen counter like a grenade, threatening to destroy the fragile peace I'd built for myself. Finally, I took it to my next session with Delphine. She didn't tell me what to do, she never did, but she asked questions that helped me figure it out for myself. "What are you afraid of finding inside?" she asked. "I don't know. Manipulation, probably. Some attempt to make me feel guilty, or to convince me that everything was somehow my fault." "Is that what you believe? That it was your fault?" "No, not anymore. It was true, mostly. The work we'd done together had helped me separate my responsibility from theirs. But I'm afraid that reading her words might make me doubt that. And if it does, what then?" I thought about it. "Then I come back here, and we work through it again." Delphine nodded. "You're stronger than you think you are, Vera. Whatever's in that letter, you'll survive it." That night, I opened the envelope. My mother's letter was 2 pages long, handwritten on lined prison paper. I read it once, then again, then a third time. She didn't apologize. She didn't take responsibility. She didn't acknowledge Celeste or the Kowalskis or any of the other people she and my father had hurt. Instead, she wrote about herself, her loneliness in prison, her health problems, her disappointment in me for betraying the family. The final line was the worst. "Everything we did for you. Someday you'll understand that." I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. Then I carried it to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched it burn. 2 years after my parents' conviction, I had my first art show. It was a small affair, just a local gallery in Hartwell, nothing prestigious, but it felt like a milestone. The collection was called Erasure, and it featured a series of paintings exploring themes of loss, memory, and recovery. The centerpiece was a large canvas depicting Celeste's house, finally rendered the way I'd wanted it. Not photorealistic, but emotionally true. The red door glowed like a beacon. The rose bushes seemed to pulse with life. And in the foreground, 2 figures held hands, a woman in a blue sundress and a small girl with a gap-toothed smile. Nana came to the opening. So did Marin and Petra. Even Linnea, my childhood best friend, made the trip. We'd reconnected the year before, after she saw a news article about the trial and reached out. She'd spent 12 years wondering what had happened to me, why I'd disappeared without a word. Learning the truth had been painful for both of us, but it had also been healing. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by people who had been part of my life before and after the fire, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Wholeness, maybe, or the beginning of it. Delphine came too. She bought one of the smaller pieces, a painting of 2 hands reaching for each other across a dark void. When she handed me the check, she smiled. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not just for the art, for all of it. I couldn't have done it without you." "That's not true. You did the hard work yourself. I just asked questions." I laughed, and for once the sound didn't feel forced or hollow. It felt real. A year later, I received another envelope, this time from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter explaining that a civil suit against my parents' estate had finally been settled. The families they'd defrauded, including the Kowalskis, had been awarded damages from the seized assets. But that wasn't why the law firm was contacting me. Celeste, it turned out, had owned a small piece of property, the craftsman house with the red door. She'd bought it outright just before her death, using savings she'd accumulated over years of frugal living. When she died, the property had gone to my mother as next of kin. My mother had never sold it, never done anything with it. It had sat empty for nearly 2 decades, maintained by automatic payments from an account Celeste had set up. Now, as part of the legal settlement, the house was being transferred to me. I drove out to see it on a Saturday morning in October. The anniversary of the fire had just passed, and I'd been thinking about beginnings and endings, about the strange loops that life sometimes makes. The house looked smaller than I remembered from the photograph, or imagined, since I had no real memories of it. The red door had faded to a dusty rose, and the rose bushes had grown wild, their thorny branches reaching toward the windows like grasping fingers. But the bones of the place were good. It needed work, but it was solid. I let myself in with the key the lawyers had sent. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old paper. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the dim light. I moved through the room slowly, trying to feel something, some connection to the aunt I'd never really known, some echo of the child I'd been before everything went wrong. In the back bedroom, I found Celeste's studio. Her easel was still set up by the window, an unfinished canvas resting on it. The painting was of a garden, lush, vibrant, alive with color. She must have been working on it when she died. I stood there for a long time, looking at those brushstrokes, trying to imagine her hands making them. My aunt, the dreamer, the one who'd tried to save me and paid for it with her life. "I'm sorry I didn't get to know you," I said to the empty room. "I'm sorry they took that from both of us." There was no answer, of course, just dust motes floating in the sunlight. But when I finally turned to leave, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small envelope tucked behind the canvas, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter, written in handwriting I recognized from the photograph's inscription, Celeste's handwriting. It was addressed to me, "My dearest Vera." The letter began, "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this letter sits here forever, undiscovered, while we grow old together and laugh about how paranoid I was. But your parents are dangerous, sweetheart. I've learned things about them, things I can't ignore, things I have to do something about, and I'm afraid of what they might do to stop me. I want you to know that I love you. I've loved you since the moment you were born, this perfect little person who looked up at me with your mother's eyes and somehow saw past all the things I got wrong about myself. You made me want to be better. You made me believe I could be. Whatever happens, please don't blame yourself. You're just a child. None of this is your fault. I've left evidence with someone I trust, your grandmother. If the worst happens, she'll keep it safe until you're old enough to understand, until you're strong enough to do what needs to be. I believe in you. I believe you'll grow up to be brave and true. I believe you'll find a way things right, even if it takes years, even if it's hard. Remember the summers we spent together? The paintings we made? The stories we told? Hold on to those memories, sweetheart. They're real. They're yours. No one can take them from you. All my love, forever, Aunt Celeste." I sat on the floor of her studio and cried. Not the desperate, broken crying I'd done in Petra's arms, but something quieter. Grief mixed with gratitude. Loss braided with love. My aunt had known. She'd known what my parents were capable of, and she'd tried to protect me anyway. She'd believed in me before I'd even become someone worth believing in. I moved into the craftsman house that winter. It took months of work to make it livable. Repairing the roof, updating the plumbing, clearing out decades of accumulated debris. But I did most of it myself, learning as I went, feeling my aunt's presence in every room I restored. Nana helped when she could. She was in her 80s now, moving slower than before, but her mind was sharp as ever. She told me stories about Celeste while we worked. Funny stories, sad stories, stories that made my aunt feel real in a way the photographs never quite had. "She would have loved to see what you've done with this place," Nana said one afternoon, looking around the freshly painted living room. "She would have loved to know you. I wish I could remember her. Maybe you do, somewhere. Maybe those memories are still in there, just waiting to come back." I thought about that sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and I could almost imagine I wasn't alone. Maybe memory wasn't like a filing cabinet, with everything stored in neat folders that could be pulled out on demand. Maybe it was more like a garden. Some things grew in the light, visible and tended, while others put down roots in the dark, shaping us in ways we couldn't see. On the 5th anniversary of my parents' conviction, I received one last surprise. A lawyer contacted me to say that my father had died in prison. Heart attack, sudden and final. They wanted to know if I wished to claim the body. I said no. A week later, I got a call from the warden. My mother wanted to see me. She was requesting a visit, her first such request since her conviction. I thought about it for days. Part of me wanted to go, wanted to look her in the eye and ask all the questions I'd never had the chance to ask. Why Celeste? Why the Kowalskis? Why any of it? But a larger part of me understood that there were no answers she could give that would make sense of what she'd done. Some damage couldn't be explained or justified or forgiven. It could only be survived. I wrote her a letter instead. "Mom, I received your request to visit. I've decided not to come. I've spent years trying to understand you, trying to find some explanation for the choices you made, but I don't think there is one. You chose money and power over everything else, over your sister, over innocent people, over me. Those were your choices, and you have to live with them. I hope you find some kind of peace before you die. I really do. But I can't be part of your journey anymore. I have my own life to build, my own healing to do." Celeste believed I could be brave and kind and true. I'm trying to prove her right. Goodbye, Vera. I mailed the letter and never looked back. It's been 10 years now since I turned my parents in. I'm 36, living in Celeste's house, teaching art classes at the community center just like she once did. The irony isn't lost on me. I've become a version of the aunt I never got to know, carrying on her work, living in her space, trying to honor her memory in small, everyday ways. Nana passed away 2 years ago, peacefully in her sleep. I was with her at the end, holding her hand, telling her stories about the garden I'd planted in Celeste's yard. She smiled at that, and her last words to me were, she would be so proud. I still see Marin and Petra regularly. Petra got married last year, and I went to the wedding. stood in the crowd and watched this woman who my parents had nearly killed dance with her new husband, laughing and beautiful and alive. It felt like proof that survival was possible. That joy could grow even in scorched earth. Linnea and I have rebuilt our friendship slowly, carefully. She visits every summer, and we sit on the porch of the Craftsman house and remember who we were before everything changed. Some of those memories are finally coming back, flickers and fragments. Nothing complete, but enough to remind me that I existed before my parents rewrote my story. I finished Celeste's painting. The garden she'd started all those years ago now hangs in my living room, her brushstrokes merged with mine. It's not a perfect blend. You can see where her work ends and mine begins, but that seems right somehow. Two artists, separated by death, but connected by blood and love and the stubborn belief that beauty matters. Delphine retired last year, but we still have lunch sometimes. She told me recently that I was one of her most memorable clients, not because my story was more dramatic than others, but because I'd done something she rarely saw. I'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me and transformed it into a life worth living. Most people just survive their trauma, she said. You turned yours into art. I think about that sometimes. When I'm teaching my students or working on a new painting or just sitting in the garden watching the roses bloom. My parents set my life ablaze when I was 14 years old. They destroyed everything I thought I knew and tried to remake me in their image. But fire doesn't only destroy. It also clears the way for new growth. It returns nutrients to the soil. It makes space for things that couldn't exist before. I'm not grateful for what they did. I never will be. But I've learned that it's possible to build something meaningful from ashes, that the story doesn't have to end where the fire started. Celeste knew that. She believed in me before I had any reason to believe in myself. And in the end, she was right.